Okay, so we can use the Django shell and the Django admin to create clothing items and update clothing items, which is awesome. But now let's actually add that ability to our application, which is probably the whole point of building an application. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go in and update our view that we created to display our clothing items. So let's go into views.py. First thing is we're going to want to import some things at the top, so we can from Django.database.db.models.functions import lower. We'll use that in a second. And then we also want to import our model. So from core.models import clothing. And now let's update our view, our function. So instead of returning HTTP response, we'll delete that for now. And the first thing we're going to want to do is get a list of all of our clothing items. So we'll save it to clothing list, and we'll say clothing.objects.all, which is what we did in the shell to get all of our items. But we're going to order them by, so we'll say .order_by lower of the title field. So this is basically saying get all the clothing items, but order them by their title, but lowercase. Because if I typed in blue jeans with a capital B versus blue jeans with a lowercase b, it'll rank them differently. So we don't want to have weird kind of orderings. So that'll take care of that. And then we want to store this clothing list in something that we can pass to our front end, our HTML page, our template. And so what we do is we create a context variable. It's a dictionary. Typically it's called context. And it's a key value pair of things that we want our front end, our application in the template to have access to. So we'll create a key called clothing list, and we'll just like so. And clothing list will be equal to this variable clothing list, which is this query set of all of our clothing items. Now, instead of returning an HTTP response, we want to return some HTML, and we could have typed HTML into that HTTP response, but that would be really hard to format. So we can use another function that is already imported called render. And so it adds another layer of abstraction, another layer of usability to the HTTP response. The first thing it takes in is a request. So we have the request right here, and we're going to pass that back into render. The next item is a template or an HTML file. And so we don't have this yet, but we're going to create this. So it's core/index.html. And then the third variable that we can pass in is this context dictionary. And so this will give us access to all of these keys right in our HTML file. So let's go ahead and save that. So now let's go ahead and create this actual index.html page, this template. So to do that, we're going to need to create a new folder or set of folders. And the way that Django wants these organized out of the box is within a folder called templates, a subfolder with the app name, and then the file. So if we right click into core and create new file, we will say templates / so it'll create a folder templates / core, the app name, and then the name of the file, so index.html. And now we can just write normal HTML, so we can give a header tag and say kind of my closet. We can check to make sure that we have clothing items first. And so within these Django templates, there's two different sort of programmatic or ways that we can inject data and logic. And so one of them is to inject logic. We can have two curly brackets with a %sign to open and close it. And then we can include logic. And the other thing that we can do is have double brackets to open and close. And this will be variables. So this will give us access to that context dictionary and those keys and those values. And so what we're going to want to do here is check to make sure that we actually have clothing items. So we're going to imply some logic. We're going to say if clothing list, which is what we passed in the context. So clothing list here. So if this is not empty, and we always have to close our logic statements. So we'll say end if, all one word. And then between these two logic statements, right, if this is true, if we do have a clothing list that's not empty, then let's render them out. So let's create an unordered list, create a set of list items. Let's loop through. So this will be a logic type of expression. So for clothing, if I can spell, for clothing underscore item in clothing list, like so. So now we can access clothing item. It'll be each item in the clothing list. But before we do that, let's close this for loop. And for, like so. And now for each item, let's just list it out. Let's add an A tag so that we can link it to the actual item page in the future. And our href for now will be blank. And then we can open up double curly brackets to actually access the variable. And we could say clothing item. And now we can, using dot notation, access fields of this item. So we have a title field. And we'll use a built-in Django tag, which is a way to kind of manipulate or interact with the information in a template here. And we'll call it the title tag, which will basically make this title case. So the first letter of each word will be capitalized to look nicer. So we'll save that. Now let's run the server and go back to our closet page. So Python manage.py run server. Back to our closet page, and we see our items black t-shirt. So you should see all the items that you actually created. So this is awesome. This is actually pulling information from our database, displaying it on our app. But we're only able to view them. So let's update this template, this page here, so we can actually enter and create a new clothing item. And the way we're going to do that is just by adding a form to this index.html template. So right below my closet, we'll add a form here that will accept as input the clothing item. So we can use a form. The action is where we want to send this form, and so it's going to be a URL. So we're going to use curly brackets with percentage. We'll say URL, and then we can use the name of the URL, that's index, because in our urls.py we defined the name. So this is why it's nice to use the name, so you don't have to hard code the actual URL. You can just use the name, and if something changes, it always maintains the correct actual URL. And then we want the method to be post, because we're going to be actually posting data. And with Django Forms, we need to include a CSRF token, which is a security kind of implementation to let the Django server know, yep, this is a valid form coming from an accepted location. So we do that with the curly bracket percentage signs, and then we type CSRF underscore token. And now we can create our input. So we're going to have a label. This will be for clothing underscore item. And we'll call it add clothing item. We'll have an input. That's a text field. So the type will be text. The name will be clothing item. And the ID will be clothing item. And then we want to have an input submit button. So input type is submit, and the value will be add clothing item. And so now we have the label for this input, which would enter the clothing item, and then a button to submit that. This is going to the URL index, which we find in our urls.py file, and the method is post because we're posting this data, and we have the CSRF token for security. So if we go back, make sure the server is running, and go back to our actual site, localhost 8000/closet, we now see this form. Now, when we click submit, nothing is going to happen because our view index doesn't know how to handle that. So let's update our view now. So let's go back into core views.py. And one thing we're going to have to also import next to render is redirect. We'll use that in a sec. But now we can update our index view here to handle a form submission. And so what we're going to want to do is create some logic to make sure this is a post request, because so far we've just been dealing with get requests. So if request, which is this object that's passed right here, dot method, we can access the method property on it equals post. So we know that this was this form submission. Then we can handle creating a clothing item in the database. We can say clothing underscore item equals request dot post dot get. So we'll access the post variable on this request object here, this post data, and we can get from that clothing item if there is such a thing. Otherwise, we'll just get an empty string. And then we can check if clothing item, so if there's actually a clothing item and something weird didn't happen, then we want to save that item to the database. So we'll say clothing.object.create title equals clothing item. So now what this is saying, what this view is doing is saying if there's a post request, try and get that post data and look for an item, a key of clothing item, and get that value. If there is this clothing item or this title of the clothing item is not empty, then go ahead and create a clothing object in the database and give it that title. Otherwise, if it's a GET request, then we just want to get all of the clothing items from the database, pass them into a context variable, and then render this page with that context. So this portion will be fired no matter what, but the above will only run if it's a post request. So make sure everything is saved. And now let's test it out. So make sure your server is running. Go back to localhost 8000/closet, give it a refresh, and then we can say white sneaker, add clothing item, and wow, that works. Awesome. So now we can actually add new clothing items to this page, to our application, and we can go ahead and do another one as an example. We could say blue gym shirt, click add clothing item, and awesome. We can create new clothing items, but when we click on a clothing item, we don't have a page to view the item or delete the item. So let's set that up now. So let's go back to our views.py, core/views.py, and create two more views, two more functional views. So one will be a detail view to view the details of a clothing item, and one will be to delete the clothing item. So we'll say def clothing underscore detail. And this will take in the request, but this will also take in the clothing ID because we need to know which clothing item to actually view, and we're going to pass that in the URL. And so then we're going to actually want to query for that specific item, clothing item equals clothing.objects.get. So this will try and get one item that matches the ID of the clothing ID that was passed in the URL. Now let's create a context dictionary. And we could say clothing item equals clothing item that we just retrieved above. And then we can return and render a template. So we'll pass in request object that gets passed above, then the template which we still need to create, and we'll call it clothing-detail.html. We still have to create this, and then we'll pass in that context dictionary so we can access the information about that clothing item. And then let's go ahead and create the view to delete the item. So we'll say clothing underscore delete, pass in the request object, and again the clothing ID of the item we want to delete. So we'll check if the request.method this time is again post. Then we'll want to get that clothing item. So we'll say clothing item equals clothing.objects.get, again where the ID equals the clothing ID that was passed into the URL. And then we want to delete that item, clothing item.delete, so it'll delete it from the database. And then no matter what, if this is a post or get, we want to return back to the home page because we just deleted the item. So we're going to return and redirect. This is where we imported the redirect up here from shortcuts because we can redirect to a different page on our site. Obviously, this page for this item is no longer going to work because we just deleted it. And so we can use index referencing the name of that index URL. So now we have these two views, but we need to create URLs for them so that Django knows when to actually run these functions. So let's go back into our urls.py file. And right below this closet path, we'll create two more paths. One of them will be closet / and then we want to pass in that clothing ID, and to pass in these URL parameters right into the URL path, we can use these triangular brackets and then define the type int, and then what we want the variable name to be, clothing underscore ID, and we need the trailing /. Then we can tell it what view to run, views.clothing-detail, and then we can give this a name again so we can reference it via the name in code, clothing-detail. We can copy this because we're going to slightly change it to just to have a delete at the end. And instead of clothing-detail, this will be clothing underscore delete, and this will be called clothing-delete. So we'll save that. And the final thing we need to do is create the templates. So we're going to go into core templates, clothing-core and create a new file, clothing-detail.html. First, we can do a check. We can check to make sure that we have a clothing item. So if clothing_item, and we got to end the if. If clothing item, let's return the title of the clothing item. So we'll double curly brackets to access the variables, and we have clothing item, and then we will access the title of it and give it this title tag from Django so that it is capitalized, and then we'll just say details. Right, this will display the title of the clothing item, blue jeans, t-shirt, whatever it is. Now let's add a form so that if somebody clicks a button in this form, we can delete that item. So we'll create a form. The action will point to that view, that delete view that we created. So we'll set it up as a URL to the name that we gave that URL, clothing-delete. And then we're going to need to pass in the ID of this item so that the view knows, hey, this is the item that we actually want to delete. And so we can just reference via the context clothing item. And just like we accessed the title property, we can access the .id property. The method of this will be post. Remember, we're looking for the post request. We also need the CSRF_token, like so. And then we'll just have one input item, which will be the submit button, because there's no actual information that needs to be entered. We will just call this delete item. So before we take a look at this, let's update our index view, because we have the list of clothing items, but they don't link to the actual clothing item. So come back into index.html, and here where we have this list item of our clothing items, where there is the href, let's go ahead and add a URL of where we want to link to. And again, this will be a URL. This will be clothing-detail. This is the name of the URL. And then we need to pass in clothing item, the property ID. So save this. Now, if we make sure the server is running and we go into our application and we go to /closet and we click on an item, we actually see this error. So let's debug it live right now. This is good. Obviously, nothing works perfectly the first time. So it says that there's no reverse match at closet/3, which is the item we were trying to reach. Reverse for clothing delete with argument, comma, not found. And so the error was in this clothing detail view. So here in context, we're saying clothing item, but we're passing in the ID, but we really want to pass in that item that we just retrieved. So then in the template, we can actually access the ID of this clothing item instead of just passing in this clothing ID. So if we update that view, this is good to see this error because these happen, right? Typos, things like that. Then we click save and we make sure the server is running and we go back and refresh the page. And we refresh the page, then we see the item. Now we should be able to click an item and view it, view its details, amazing. And if we click delete item, we delete that item and it refreshes and redirects us back to the closet all clothing items page. Awesome, so now we have a system to store and update our actual closet. So go ahead and fill out your actual clothing items in your closet or some of them. And in the next video, we will actually look into getting the weather data for a specific location where you're located, sending that as well as our closet, our clothing items to OpenAI to AI to give us a personalized AI outfit. So the next video is going to be awesome, getting everything kind of wrapped up functionality wise. I'll see you soon.